Bonjour. Nojam Indigenous Knowledge, Mainga Nodem. Lanilanape Koyandao, Lenape a king and Dunjaba. So I come from the Lenape people of southwestern Ontario. That's where we're located now. Originated on the east coast of the United States. And both of my parents are Lenape, otherwise known as Delaware. And I'm the director of the Thunderbird Partnership Foundation, and I want to talk to you today about life promotion, which is a strength-based conversation on wellness and addressing suicide prevention. And so the terminology actually comes from First Nations youth voices across Canada. And the Assembly of First Nations has a National Youth Council. And that Youth Council worked to create these calls to action on life promotion. And they're very dedicated and passionate about changing and shifting the conversation that we're having to one that is focused on life promotion versus talking about suicide prevention. So I just want to start off by asking you, what do you think is the most significant difference about those two ways of talking about this? Okay. And suicide prevention is?
Negative. It's like you've already made the decision to do it, and you're just going to intervene at the last moment.
Very good. So yeah, exactly that. Young people and have experienced interventions and supports that are focused on death and dying. And so First Nations youth are saying, we already know about death and dying. They have tons of experience with it. The rates of suicide amongst Indigenous youth in this country are out of this world, right? They're the highest in the world. But their question is, how do I make a decision to live life? What information do I use? How do you talk to me about why I should live to tomorrow when everything around me seems like it's completely impossible and there's no reason to continue living? So that's the most significant piece, is shifting our perspective and our discussions from a focus on death and dying. And it's not that they don't want to have that conversation, but the bigger conversation that they're talking about needing is, how do I continue to live life? So life promotion. So Key themes for understanding suicide prevention, or understanding suicide, the nature of suicide amongst First Nations people in Canada. This draws from a paper that we commissioned and was written by Dr. Jennifer White and Dr. Chris Musquash. And so we need to know, first of all, that suicide is not an individual experience resulting from mental illness. That's critically important. So the way we look at suicide is often in the context of anxiety and depression and individual circumstances. For First Nations youth, that's not the case. Suicide is a direct result of colonization and social inequities that continue to exist. So it's important to understand that colonization is not something of the past. Colonization is still ever present and experienced by First Nations youth today. And then suicide amongst First Nations youth is situated in those broad social, political, and historical contexts that call our attention to the legacy of colonial attempts on assimilation. And so First Nations youth are still experiencing the impacts and the forces of assimilation even today. Now, what do you think might be some of those situations of assimilation that young people might experience today? One thing. What do you think? What's an experience of assimilation that First Nations youth are experiencing today?
Child and family services.
Absolutely. Child and family services. We have more children in child and family services today than we have ever had in the residential school system. And who is looking after those children in child and family services? For children who are in child and family services, predominantly not First Nations people. And where First Nations families are funded to look after our own children, they're funded significantly different than mainstream Canada Child and Family Services. And so the forces of assimilation have not gone away. These are real lived experiences for First Nations youth every day. And so they live with those social inequities on a daily basis. And so our main focus on what are the conditions that help to promote life for First Nations youth, their families, and that has to be our focus. What promotes life? What will help them to flourish so that youth want to live life? So I want to talk to you about some promising practices for promoting life. And have you seen our land-based service delivery model poster presentation? Pretty proud of that. And it comes from a worldview of Indigenous people that says, without the land, we can't practice our way of life. And so this quote comes specifically from Cree youth that were involved in the conversation. And so cultural continuity and access to culture is starting to have more prominence in our conversations, in our communities, amongst service providers, at policy level, within research. And we have to stay true to that course because Indigenous knowledge and cultural factors have lived on the periphery. It's not that they've gone away, but through assimilation and colonization, they've been discounted and displaced. And so as we think about how do we promote life, again, it's not the expert-driven approach to address the mental illness. It has to be within the context of the social determinants of health, as previous presenters have talked about. And then we have to think about that from an Indigenous lens. So our efforts to restore land claims, our place of belonging, our control over education, what's in our education systems, and how are we reflected in our education systems. I was looking at this hotel as I spent the last 3 days here, and all of these glorious pictures say First Nations people are prominent in this land. They belong here. And I want to take a moment to recognize the Dene, the Cree, the Bloods, the Blackfoot people of this nations of this land, and Métis populations as well. So our language as a people is what holds our worldview. And so when people talk about the importance and significance of speaking an Indigenous language, the investment isn't just about learning a vocabulary. It's more than that. It's an investment in helping young people to reconnect to a way of thinking, to be able to appreciate and to empower them with knowing that their worldview is held within the language. And that is what informs how they see the world. And it gives them some understanding about their difference. And so the connection to identity, connection to spirituality is what facilitates an attachment to life. It is what facilitates a sense of belonging in this world. Our identity is what tells us our purpose and the meaning of our life. And from that, our knowledge as Indigenous people, there are many healing practices that our people still have access to. And again, they're on the periphery, they're facilitated by people who live that way of life outside of formal programs and services. And oftentimes when they're brought into formal programs and services, because we don't understand their knowledge and their skill base, they're paid with an honorarium. They're paid with a gift and maybe a tobacco tie, which is a sacred medicine that's often a protocol for engaging cultural practitioners and elders. We don't understand their knowledge and skills from the same place that we understand social work, psychology, psychiatry, pharmacy. And yet our elders and our cultural practitioners have skills and knowledge that align with those things. Connection to family and community, First Nations governance and self-determination. I was thinking about this when you were talking about opioids and young people. In our communities that have had a lot of success with opioid, community-based opiate agonist treatment is because it's under the governance of the community. And so it's a whole of community approach that is inclusive of and facilitates a connection to land. And then strengthening social capital and support, building our infrastructure, reliance on Indigenous knowledge to define wellness. These are characteristics of best practices that make a difference. And so I want to share with you this one diagram, and I'm not going to go into all of it because this could be a teaching that would go on for days. But this comes from an elder. His name is Peter O'Chese from Alberta. His spirit name was Akunini. And so the mental wellness continuum framework says that we have to be paying attention to wellness across the lifespan. And it says culture is the foundation. And so we went looking for where is the Indigenous knowledge that helps us to understand wellness across the lifespan. And so this is an example. And so we've been having conversations with Indigenous knowledge keepers and elders across the country, and consistently across our cultures, across our language groups, people have knowledge of the specific cultural practices that were important for taking care of the spirit journey across life. And so pre-birth, there were things that we did at birthing, in early childhood, at the adolescent stage of life. And every stage of life, there are cultural practices that tether and strengthen and nurture the spirit of people across the lifespan. And so those are the practices that have been displaced through assimilation and colonization, but the knowledge hasn't gone away, and the practices are still lived. So this is our life currently without those cultural practices as a result of colonization and assimilation. So before our children are born, we're dealing with the impacts of intergenerational trauma. And we know from our study in epigenetics and microbiota and its impact on birthing that intergenerational impacts are present before birth. So the more generations I have back in the residential school, with residential school experience, my parents, my grandparents, great-grandparents, the higher risk I have for anxiety, depression, and suicide. That's intergenerational trauma. That's epigenetics. It's the impact of our environment, changes the expression of our potential. And then we also have addictions, right? With opioids, with alcohol, before birth. And then at birth, what is the experience? Well, if we don't have a good relationship with child welfare and they're not supportive, we don't have services that are investing in keeping mom and baby together, then we have child welfare there ready to scoop up our children and take them away, no less different than the scoop of the 60s. And then we're seeing more neurological disorders. And neurological disorders informed and facilitated by the high stress environments that pregnant women live in, when they don't have the right supports, when we're looking at them with judgment and discrimination. We have neurological disorders. So things like Asperger's and autism are the products of high stress in pregnancy oftentimes, especially for Indigenous women. In BC, they say that they're underdiagnosed, but that is the experience. And then at the adolescent stage of life, the experience is the expression of the trauma. And most often that's where we hear the expression of the experience of sexual abuse, which is oftentimes talked about as the underlying issue for the opioid addiction, as well as for suicides and the suicide crisis. And then typically our people had an understanding about the risk for suicide at that emerging adult, young adult stage of life. And so our knowledge base talked about that, what were the risk factors and how we took care of that from our own knowledge and cultural practices. And that's where it would show up. And the teaching was that if you can't find the meaning for your life, then you may choose to step out of life. That's how our people talked about it. But suicide is happening much earlier. It's happening in childhood. And it's happening much later in an older population. And so these experiences compound across the lifespan, so that when we get to the elder stage of life, which is about giving away, ensuring that you're transferring knowledge to the next generation, we are seeing more neurological disorders, so like things like Alzheimer's and dementia. And then we don't have our practices that take care of death and the spirit journey. And so suicide for Indigenous people cannot be addressed in isolation. There's many, many factors that lead to suicide amongst our population, and most of all, colonization, oppression, and racism. And so to prevent suicide, we have to address those underlying issues of domestic violence, child abuse, intergenerational trauma, unemployment, the social determinants of health factors. But we have to ask ourselves, what is wellness? So if we take care of those issues, what are we moving towards? Because if our focus is not about death and dying, then our focus can also not be about deficits only. We have to have a vision for where we're going. And so we have to have conversations about how do we understand wellness? And how do we understand wellness from a whole person perspective? And if you've been in any of my other talks this week, you would have heard me talk about the Indigenous Wellness Framework. Hope, belonging, meaning, and purpose is an Indigenous definition of wellness. And so when we're thinking about, well, how do I promote life? Then you should be thinking about what is it that we do that actually facilitates hope for young people, gives them a sense of belonging, that they belong in society, they belong in Canada, they have a place in this world, that we care about them, and that life has meaning for them, and that meaning that we have responsibility for facilitating is everywhere in life. It's not just on the reserve. It's not just in Indigenous specific services, that it's visible, present, and can be experienced in every aspect of a young person's life, and that they see purpose for their living. And so these 13 indicators are the guide for how do we get to those things, invest in identity, know the worldview, facilitate our services by values that are meaningful to First Nations people. Have conversations to know what those values are. And then in terms of relationship and connection to family and community of choice, then also facilitate the connection to land and environment and our relatives that live there too. That's how we facilitate an attitude towards living life. Our knowledge systems are still intact. They're still accessible by Indigenous people. These are our educational institutions. Our lodges look different across the country, but they're firmly planted in the earth. That's how our elders talk about them. They're firmly planted in the earth, and so they're still ever present and accessible by First Nations people. These are our universities. So I encourage you to never grow a wishbone where your backbone ought to be, meaning, geez, I wish life was better for First Nations people. I wish somebody would do something about the high rates of kids in child welfare. I wish somebody would do something before they graduate to the justice system. I wish somebody would do something about making life better for them in the education system. And so you're all here, you all are intelligent people, and so I'm saying to you that we all have responsibility for ensuring life continues for First Nations youth. Thank you.